Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. International and local immigration issues on our agenda today. We'll begin with the big picture. A small delegation of German scholars is in St. Louis to compare notes with American counterparts on incorporating immigrants and refugees into their communities. We have one of those scholars with us in studio. Professor Adriano Udani is assistant professor in the political science department at the University of Missouri St. Louis. His research has focused on African immigrants. Professor Florian Sichling is an assistant professor in UMSL School of Social Work. He studies the Bosnian community here. Jorg Ploger is a senior researcher at ILS, a development and research institute in Dortmund, Germany. Germany has had its own issues with the influx of immigrants. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us. Great to have you. Jorg,
thank you for having us.
Welcome to St. Louis.
Thank you very much, Don.
Adriano, let me begin with you. In view of current national policies, how successful are we today in incorporating immigrants and refugees into our communities?
It's a good question. I would say that there's two sides, or maybe two stories. One story would say that the picture of America is where immigrants see an America that provides opportunity and mobility. And so that story would say that we're very successful. But there's another story in the sense that others would argue that when immigrants look at St. Louis or the United States broadly, that they see rather a ceiling. Just sort of a cap that caps what kind of jobs they have, how much money they can make, where they can live, what kind of schools they can go to. So based on how well we're doing, I mean, it seems like overwhelming research would suggest that it depends on the skills, education, and also the sort of privileged identities that immigrants bring with them to the United States based on how similar they look like to the receiving context will typically depend and structure how incorporated they become in a community.
I guess if we look to the Bosnian community here, we see a pretty good example of how well people can assimilate. Florian?
That's true. I'm fairly new to St. Louis myself. I moved here 3 years ago and from Chicago. I'm actually from Germany. And when I came here, people were saying we don't have a lot of immigrants, but we have the Bosnians. And so I got really interested in them, particularly since they are typically described as an immigrant success story. And as I was digging deeper into this, there's a fair amount of research, especially Ben Moore at Fontbonne University and Eilina Karamirc here at SLU have done a lot of work on health and oral histories. But there's not a lot of insight into how the second generation is doing, the children of the first generation who were born in St. Louis and are actually growing up here. And so part of the research focus of our project is on the experience of the second generation and sort of the decisions that they make as they sort of graduate from high school and then move on with their careers. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the Bosnians is that a lot of them actually came from Germany. And I remember them when I was younger, in the refugee shelters down the street. And at some point they just disappeared. And then, 15 years, I'm catching up with them in St. Louis. And it's and a lot of them are really positive about their experience in Germany. And they say that, the ability to have worked and sort of saved up some money before they came to the U.S. actually really helped them with their initial start here.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's turn to our German guest here and find out how well things are going in Dortmund. Jorg Ploger, tell us how things are going in Dortmund at the present time. You have a lot of refugees and immigrants there.
Yes, we have, Don. There are, this has been over the global news. Germany has received large numbers of migrants, of refugees, of how we call them asylum seekers, because that's technically who they become. The city of Dortmund, which is like St. Louis, an old industrial larger city, has also received substantial numbers. I think the number was about 8,000 refugees that came and had to be housed and integrated into local society. So it's they put quite a lot of pressure on local services, and particularly at the beginning in finding adequate housing and then Second, after that, the pressure on like things like integration, like how to get these people into the labor market, language courses, etc. And of course, Germany has received this massive influx of migration recently, but also maybe in difference to the U.S., it has only recently been recognizing itself as a migrant society, which we are sort of like lacking a few decades behind. And
from what we've been reading here, it's my impression that acceptance of the refugees has not been overwhelmingly positive in Germany.
There have been different, let's say, the different phases of this whole thing. At the beginning, the reception was overwhelmingly welcoming. There was crisis going on in countries in the Middle East, particularly. So we, as a society who are rich and with a booming economy, can help those. But as numbers grew and the pressure on the social systems was also increasing, the media and public and political response to it has shifted towards something needs to be done. So deals were struck with countries like Turkey to basically make an end to that informalized Balkan route that through former Yugoslavia that brought lots of those migrant movements to Germany. And probably also the overall discourse in the society has shifted and has become more ambiguous, and there's still welcoming people, so there's lots of welcoming things going on, but there's also the rise of right-wing political parties which are directly related to that issue.
Because of the public concerns about immigration.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what, yeah.
Yeah. Adriano, what can we teach Germany? Or should it be the other way around?
Well, that's what we're trying to work through in this really interesting research partnership is what are the similarities and what are the lessons learned. I mean, I think if anything, we could learn from each other and really the central role that neighborhoods and place plays in trying to facilitate immigrant incorporation. And so as Jorg sort of talk about it, immigrants and their advocates usually coalesce around these threats or these crises. After the 2016 election, the surprising outcome, I think a lot of the immigrant advocates here in St. Louis, the question became one of implementation, right? So what's going to happen? How soon do we have until some of these punitive immigration reforms ideas become a reality? And so props to immigrant advocates here like the Micro Project, Mira. They really reached out to try to figure out what are the rights of migrant communities here, just expressing calls for solidarity. And I think the nonprofit and charitable organizations are critical in cities like St. Louis, in our region, to make sure that they are these mediating institutions between marginalized groups and areas where the government is sort of lacking. And so that's sort of where I think we could sort of provide as a platform to really look at how Germany, where the state has a stronger presence and a stronger visibility in creating a safety net, and the extent to which neighborhoods sort of shape the immigrant or migrant experience in Germany. So I think we have something to learn from Germany in the sense that if you look at St. Louis, a lot of the territory of immigrant service provision is in the jurisdictions of nonprofits and churches, right? Mm-hmm. And so across our many municipalities, there's few governments that actually have institutionalized government programs, with some exceptions. And so that's something that's interesting and has a long history of shaping. And so the nonprofits and churches here have an elevated role. But it sounds like the churches in Germany also have that sort of pivotal role as well.
Mm-hmm. Florian, you have seen this from two sides, in Germany and here. What are you seeing, and what sense do you have as to what works and doesn't work?
So there are two things. I want to make a distinction between immigrants as a group and refugees,
Sure.
which are sometimes lumped together. But I think there's a critical difference because refugees come here with a different status. They tend to have a work permit when they arrive, and they have a clear path to citizenship, which is not the case for a lot of other immigrant groups.
Refugees are fleeing some
Right.
sort of a problem
Right.
that they're leaving
Right.
behind. Yeah.
And it brings me to the second point, because there's also a lot of similarities between the United States and Germany, because a lot of the times institutions that deal with refugee resettlement in particular are charged with resolving politically contradicting messages about why the purpose of immigration, right? There's, on the one hand, this humanitarian motive of helping people that are fleeing persecution, and then there's a strong economic incentive to bring in highly skilled people that sort of fuel a local economy. And I've heard both of those in the current debates in Germany and in St. Louis. Those are not the same thing. And those are not the same kind of people. But in the absence of sort of a comprehensive idea about what it is that immigration is supposed to do and what it's supposed to look like, institutions like, the International Institute that does great work, but also a lot of the government agencies in Germany are then charged with having to resolve that contradiction in the way in which they serve immigrants. And a lot of the times that's an impossible task.
But I would think it's probably better to have a state involvement as opposed to depending on nonprofits, simply because of the resources of the state. You think that's true, Jorg?
My personal opinion would be yes, but I also know how the situation is in the U.S., so this is a little disclaimer here. Of course, if there is a pronounced state, if the state has lots of powers and has also the resources to deal with these larger issues, there can be a much more strategic response to pressures on the system. And also the overall response is equal in each place. It doesn't depend on whether a place has a strong concentration of institutions that care for these groups, because there may be other places where the institutional networks are less pronounced and they would then fall off the map. But this is maybe less the case in Germany, where the state is, let's say, more or less everywhere, and then brings in a more coherent approach. On the other hand, the reason why, because we don't have such a pronounced nonprofit sector, means also that sometimes the organizations can be less close to the needs and specific purposes of an immigrant community. So there's probably a little bit more distance there than in many of the U.S. cases. So it's a little bit seeing both sides of the story here.
And if I could sort of respond, in some of my own work, I'm a co-principal investigator of a national Latino study during and after and before the 2016 election. And so we can use Trump's election as a natural experiment. And the results clearly show that dark-skinned Latino males who live in more punitive states worried about immigration enforcement affecting their lives on an everyday basis. And so they were more likely to carry their papers to prove their legal presence. They were more likely to think that law enforcement agents were going to stop and question them. And so what also it shows, sort of emphasizes the role of the local community is the people who felt that immigration enforcement was sort of more central in their lives also had a higher rate of utilizing these local community programs, were likely to go to church and seek churches as a form of refuge. And so, they were acted as these places that provided safety and protection from, sort of a national crisis.
Yeah. We have one local church, I think it's in Maplewood, basically housing someone who is seeking sanctuary and receiving it at this particular church. It's the only case I know of locally where that's going on.
That's right, yeah.
We have to take a break. We'll do that now and come back and continue our conversation on incorporating immigrants and refugees into our communities. We'll do that in just a moment. Stay with us. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. Welcome back as we continue our discussion on incorporating immigrants and refugees into our communities. My guests in studio are Professors Florian Sichling and Adriano Udani from the University of Missouri St. Louis, and to Jorg Ploger visiting from Dortmund, Germany. Jorg, let me come back to you with regard to this distinction that Florian made about refugees and immigrants. How is that dealt with in your country and in Dortmund? Are they treated separately or differently?
That same distinction is, I can make the same case for Germany as well. We had migration phases in Germany over recent decades. The country has become much more diverse than it was in the past, but also that large influx of refugees has been on top of that, basically. So it's a different set. It's a different migration group because it came out of for different reasons, motivations, because there was political warfare in their countries and they were fleeing violence maybe. While the migrants, as Florian has pointed out rightly, they come for different reasons. They come because they are seeking work, because they come for family reunification and receive a visa for that. They come out of their own volition. They have different access to the institutions of the society and the labor market, and they are likely to be much more integrated into the society. So I completely would subscribe to that notion of Florian as well, that it's not easy to talk about these two groups in the same way. And there's also a bias which is going on in Germany, and this has been referred to already, that increasingly political migration policy is sort of evolving a bias towards skilled and unskilled migrants, while the skilled migrants find it much more easier than in the past to come into the country. The reasons behind this are obviously economic, and also there's a demographic change going on in Germany, so there is a high will of political policymakers to bring in more people who are skilled to fill in specific jobs in the knowledge economy, while for low-skilled, the barriers are higher now, so it's less easy to come into the country.
What is the employment situation like in Germany right now?
It's relatively good. Germany has had an economic growth phase for a long period, actually, now. So we are in this quite strange situation of having an economic boom phase related to a demographic decline of the population. So there were discussions before the refugee influx already about bringing in more higher skilled migrants because the labor market was needing them. And this is also what in the beginning, when the refugees came, was sort of the discourse driving this whole thing, when Chancellor Merkel said, you're welcome to these groups, that there was an economic rationale behind this. So maybe we find a lot of high-skilled people among those refugees who can actually fill our labor demands, and then can do apprenticeships, and they can fill specific jobs like engineers or IT professionals on the health and care sector where a skill shortage was already visible.
I lived in Germany for a period of years in the 1960s, going back, and at that particular time, unemployment was zero, and they had the guest workers mostly from Turkey, and they were welcomed very enthusiastically. I gather it's a little less enthusiastic now.
That's probably the case. The guest workers, that's another distinction. They came on technically they came on a temporary basis. Most of them then stayed on, but they were supposed not to stay on, which is quite a distinction here. The unemployment levels are higher, but compared to maybe 10 years ago, they have decreased. So we have higher unemployment on average than in the U.S. The counting is also different statistically. So there's always a proportion of the population who's not in the labor market and seeking employment, maybe not finding it. That's an issue that Germany has been dealing with for decades now. The reception context has changed. That's true, but also the society has changed. So there is more openness towards migration on one hand of the society, and there's less openness on the other hand. So it's a social, it's a confrontation issue.
Adriano, what about that part of the immigration situation here in this country, jobs, and the jobs that immigrants have and can't get.
Sure. I think if there are institutional, there are economic forces that bias this rush to get H-1B visa holders, sort of the group of immigrants that bring in a high amount of education, and it's a competition. I mean, if you interview employers and you interview governments, it's a competition to get these limited visas so that you secure a more skilled resource. However, what I find, though, is in states that do try to attract a more quote-unquote high-skilled labor market, that has a feedback effect in the sense that they're also more likely to adopt more restrictive programs to sort of put more requirements that dissuade lower-skilled immigrants in food services, manufacturing sort of service jobs, so that they don't resettle in those states. And so, I think they both reinforce one another. These separate employment channels aren't sort of independent and existing in space. They're sort of biased towards this new age, this sort of new economy that I think Dortmund and also St. Louis City are trying to redefine themselves, which I thought was an interesting similarity that we found during our time over the weekend.
That's right.
I want to say something about jobs, because I think that is one of the major changes that have happened in the past decade. So when people in this country talk about sort of like the turn of the century immigrants from Europe, and that it's always been an immigrant society, I think they entered a very different context. The U.S. is not the same as it was before. And one of the things that's changed is the employment structure that now consists not of manufacturing but of a highly segmented service sector. So a lot of the processes that the previous waves of generations of immigrants have gone through over long periods of time now have to happen within one generation. And the deciding factor is education, like whether they're able to actually jump into better paid and higher prestige sort of occupations.
That's an issue for homegrown population, too, for a large part of it, no question about it. Our time is winding down, but I do want to get a call in from Glenda, who's calling from O'Fallon, Illinois. I think she has a question perhaps for our German guest. Glenda, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. My question, one of the parts of my question related to the aging population, and you guys kind of covered that, so I appreciate that. The second part was, it seems like Germany should be a leader in this field due to the late 80s, early 90s experience of reintegrating Germany, East and West Germany together. And I just was wondering if your guest could speak to that experience for the country and how that is helping or hurting or leading them in what they're dealing with today. Thanks. I'll take my time off the air.
Thanks for the question. Reunification was a unique moment in time for Germany. It's one of the very few instances in time when a country was reunified. And basically what happened is that the former socialist East Germany was integrated into the Western German context. So it wasn't a fusion of two systems. It was sucked into another system. And this has caused problems. It has caused structural problems because much of the employment base disappeared in former Eastern Germany. It also had political problems that caused this. Immigration to the two parts of Germany have been very, very different because Eastern Germany had hardly any immigration before the reunification, only some contract worker from former socialist countries, but not in great numbers. While Western Germany, at least the industrial cities, were already having a large share of migration. So there was a specific experience. And this also ended up in different political and on-the-street sort of reactions to immigration. While in Western Germany is becoming accepted that a migration society is in formation, Eastern Germany had instances of racist violence against immigrants in the early 90s. And also, I think you can track this down until today in terms of the response to refugee migration, which has been different. I'm not saying these are this is definitely not a black and white picture that I want to draw here, because it's a much more nuanced thing. But to pin it down here, I think also you can track this whole path of migration down until today, where the reaction to migration and refugees has been different in these two parts of the city. And it's also ending up politically in new parties that are emerging on the right of the political spectrum and are receiving substantial votes in more disadvantaged areas in Germany.
Long-term political impact from what's going on here today, no question about it. Our time is winding down, and we have a caller, Tom. Tom, I'm going to ask you to wait. I think what you want to talk about will be more applicable in our next segment, so please stay with us on the line. But I'll ask each of you, starting with you, Florian, what do you expect or think could come of the kind of conference or gathering or exchange of ideas that you're having here today with our friends from Germany?
So I think the biggest value of going abroad or somewhere else is always that you learn a different perspective on what you have back home. And I hope that's what's going to happen with this exchange that's going on.
Adriano, how about you?
Yeah, I think the role of neighborhood and institutions, in the sense that immigrants, the research tends to show, sort of follow this sort of segmented assimilation path. But it would be interesting to see how local institutions and neighborhoods, whether they do or do not, sort of facilitate that pathway to feeling included in areas and feeling that they can make decisions with sort of full information and feel welcome.
Will a report or something come of it that will be distributed to people who might be able to influence the situation?
Absolutely. I think that's sort of what we concluded before we met with you was sort of the plan for dissemination. We'd be happy to share the lessons learned and also any sort of production that comes forth.
Jorg, we'll give you the last word. What do you think might come of this gathering?
Well, first of all, I agree with what my colleagues have already said, but maybe one more angle which I'm particularly interested in as an urban scholar or urban geographer is that I'm particularly interested also in the spatial setting of older industrial larger cities like St. Louis and Dortmund and other places in the world, which are particular reception context for immigration and which are particular contexts where neighborhood development is different than to the high-growth cities that we all know in our countries as well. So there's a particular set of problems being dealt with, and I think this context needs more study as well.
And more discussion. I want to thank you all so much for being with us and being part of this discussion here today. Thanks to immigration specialists, Professors Florian Sichling and Adriano Udani from the University of Missouri St. Louis, and Jorg Ploger, visiting from Dortmund, Germany. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.